Welcome to my channel on the Ancients. Today's episode is all about what is underneath the Sphinx. In case you're new to my channel, I'll give you a quick overview of what it's all about. Firstly, I feel it's important to explain that the things I have to tell you come from regressions, dream regressions. So they're dreams I've had all my life, and I can no longer ignore them, no matter how much I've tried. I've got many years of journals, and they're filled with these stories of my dreams. I never planned to do anything with the stories, but after I retired, I was going through all my stuff, sorting things out, and I tried to throw out the journals, but I couldn't. I knew in my gut that I had to share my stories. Actually, I think I've known for a long time, but until now I just shut out those thoughts and got on with being a perfectly boring chartered accountant. I'm telling you all this before we start because even if you think I'm a complete crackpot, you might still enjoy my stories, just because they are interesting. But if you actually believe, as I do, that they are memories of a past life, then these stories may give you some answers that you've been looking for. This episode is about something I've been asked about many times, and because I've really only got bits of it, it's taken me a while to go through the journals and try to find all the references to it, but it's about what I saw under the Sphinx. I have one main dream about it, and others are just bits. But here it is, and it's pieced together, and in order for me to tell you the actual story of the dream, I should really start by telling you the story of the Sphinx and the phases of the Sphinx as I remember them from the dreams. So the first phase was before the universities. It was really just a large rock sticking out of the ground. It kind of had a certain look about it, looked like an animal's head sticking out of the ground, but it was really a very large rock, that's all. Anyway, when we entered into the early phase of setting up the universities, I was actually a child at that point in time, but, I did get to see things. But that early phase, when the universities were being set up, that was when the Sphinx was carved into just a head. There was no body to it. It was just the bit that was sticking out of the ground was carved into the head of a lion. Then, a long time after that, the university had grown a lot and it was very active. And I don't know why, but for some reason, they decided to carve into the bedrock and put a body on the head that everyone loved so much. The university was a great place in those days, and it was pretty much unchanged after that for quite a long time. Then came changes in the climate, which takes us to the fourth phase, because the climate changed so much that it resulted in that site being abandoned, and the university was moved to a different part of Kem, and eventually parts of the plateau even ended up underwater, and that's long before the actual deluge. It was just one of those phases that it went through. But because of its location, it was re-established, and this was during the era of Japay. A new set of pyramids were built, and those are the 3 pyramids that are still there. The sixth phase is Kem was selected as a location to hold what I've called the restarter kits for humanity in case of a worldwide disaster. And it was one of many locations. And part of that restarter kit was underneath the Sphinx. And so that's what the story is about today. But I'll keep giving the background to the Sphinx. Then in phase 7 was the terrible phase when there was a lot of turmoil in the world with various destructive things happening, and eventually the deluge happened and most of the sites of Kem were terribly ruined. It was at this time that Atlantis, or Tantal, was wiped off the face of the planet. And most of humanity and most animals were destroyed as well, a lot of them. And so it was what you would call a worldwide disaster. As for Kem, there was still quite clear evidence of civilization. It wasn't destroyed totally like Tantal. And so it was a good place to kind of start up again. And of course, it was one of the locations where things were stored in case this actually ever happened. And obviously it did. Phase 7 was after the deluge. So pretty much everything was destroyed, and it took a long time for those of us who survived to actually get around to assessing each of the sites and attempting to get civilization back underway again. It was kind of a put your own mask on first before you can assist others. But we eventually did get to Kem, and that's what I would call phase 8, and we removed everything that we had left there that we needed to set up civilization again. Then came phase 9, which was when the dynastic Egyptians took over the site. I mean, there had been some primitive people in the area for quite a long time, but it wasn't until the pre-dynastic and the dynastic Egyptians took over that they started to take a really strong interest in what we had left behind. And they seriously wanted to make the Sphinx their own. By that stage, it really wasn't looking too good anyway. It was only just recognizable as a lion. And it had also been covered with sand, and it was in pretty much a bad way. So they dug it out and renovated, and later generations did the same again. It seemed to have gone through a few phases of being left and then being renovated. Obviously, in these different phases, the Sphinx looked very, very different. And after the dynastic Egyptians had done their bit, they took the pretty wrecked-looking lion and they put a human face on it. It looked so different to the way it had looked originally. I mean, it's quite obvious that it's not in its original state. All you have to do is look at the size of the head. Even the front paws, they're an awful lot longer than I ever remember them. Of course, the Egyptian Empire went into decline and the Romans took over, and most of Egypt was left to rack and ruin. And so the Sphinx was once again covered in sand. And I would be very remiss not to mention the phase where people just did bad things to the Sphinx. Treasure hunters who dug passages to try to find treasure or to find out the secrets of the Sphinx. And it's not until relatively recently that we've been treating the Sphinx with the respect that it deserves. It's a beautiful old monument, and it's now being treated in a way that we're trying to preserve it for humanity in the future. Because wouldn't it be really, really terrible if the ravages of time just took it over and it was lost? But anyway, that leaves us to the final stage of the Sphinx, our modern era, and the scientific and archaeological work done to work out all the stages of the past. From the most recent of the digging out of the Sphinx to the various measurements of it, the alignments that people have worked out, and all the various theories that now surround the Sphinx. But you can imagine each phase is really a whole episode in its own right. One could write a whole book on the life of the Sphinx because, well, it really had many lives, I guess. But I'm just going to breeze over all this with just a bit of general history from my dreams, and then I will focus on telling you what it was like underneath the Sphinx the last time I was there. So the quick story, the story of the Sphinx for me, starts when the University of Chem was first set up on what is now known as the Giza Plateau. It was originally, as I said, just a big piece of rock sticking up out of the ground. It was very close to the river, and the place felt quite lush and tropical. And it was like that for a long time. And as I mentioned also before, changes in the climate changed the area many times over, ranging from barren desert to the period of time where it spent underwater. As for the university, it was one of the 12 institutions of Tantal, or Atlantis. It was situated, as I said, on the Giza Plateau, and initially it was fairly small, with only one pyramid, the Yellow Pyramid Obelisk. There was also the rock which we carved into the shape of the head of a lion, and there was also a mound next to it which eventually was cut into and became the body, but that had not been carved out at that point. The Sphinx wasn't just carved because it was an artistic statement and lovely to look at, but also it had a function. At that time there was a hole in the top of the head of the Sphinx, and into the hole we had a mechanism, and it was a large curved support structure for a disc, which was part of our technology at that time. I'll try to draw it, but I'm not going to go into detail about that was all about at this stage. As I said, initially the rock was sculptured into the head of a lion without a body. On top of the head was a large disc on a support structure. So that's the first stage, as we were talking about in the early history of the University of Chem. It was this time when I was studying in Chem, and I had 10 wonderful years there, and during that time the Sphinx was just a head with a disc on top of it. My next significant encounter with the Sphinx was thousands of years later. By significant, I mean spending a lot of time in Chem. I often visited the place and saw it, but I didn't spend much time there till I was asked by my brother to go and live there for a project he had planned. The project itself is another story, but I did go and live in Chem. It was many years later than the previous time that I'd lived in Chem, and by that stage, the rest of the lion carving had been done, so it had a body that had been cut into the bedrock. Chem itself was going well. It was growing and evolving, and Chem was all about the practical application of energy. So essentially that was what the university was all about. So everything that went on in and around Chem had to do with that. One of the reasons for choosing the location of Chem was the depth of the bedrock. And it was a great location, but maybe not such a wise one in terms of climate change, because whenever the climate changed, it really did affect that particular area with the height of the river going up and down, and even the river moving location. As I mentioned, it even had a time when it was underwater, and for many reasons we had to abandon that site for quite a while. The reason it was selected as a site for the re-establishment of humanity, if ever there were to be a disaster, so that it would be the place where we kept one of the, what I call restarter kits, it was partially because it would be relatively easy to find. It was assumed that no matter what happened, those massive pyramids would survive in some form or other, and it would be sufficient for us to at least be able to identify the area, or even, at worst, some future generation of humans could find it and maybe use the technology we left behind. Okay, so let's get down to business, the bits that you really want to hear about. Well, I can always revisit any of the other stuff that I've just breezed over later in another episode if enough people express an interest. So, the entrance to the Sphinx. Or should I say, the entrance to under the Sphinx. Because we didn't leave any entrances to the Sphinx as such. So the entrance to under the Sphinx is a reasonable distance in front of the Sphinx. I think that the area where the entrance is probably where the Sphinx temple is currently now. Mind you, I could be wrong because the length and size of the pores has thrown me. It's not the same size that it was that I remember. Those pores stick out a lot longer than they did when I saw them. But it isn't near the body of the Sphinx, I can tell you that for a fact. So it is beyond the pores. I will do my best to map out where I think it is. The entrance that I remember wasn't a door or an entranceway into a tunnel or anything like that. It was a large shaft that looked a bit like this picture that I'm putting on the video at the moment. It was sealed using a very, very large stone slab, and it actually sat inside the shaft on the shaft had like a little edge all around it, and it sat inside the shaft like a lid would. So this massive stone slab that acted like a lid on the shaft was really important because we didn't want to make it very obvious where the entrance was, and that was our best way to ensure that it wasn't going to be just so obvious, come in and take everything kind of obvious. But we were very good at making a place sealed, well sealed, especially from the perspective of people who were breaking into the area. We could make a wall look like it was completely natural rock and provide let's say a distraction in a different direction to something that we didn't care if people saw or found. Anyway, the shaft. It descended a long way. I'm going to try and guess, but as I've mentioned, I didn't have any somnambulant tape measures with me, so this is purely a guess. My guess is 15 to 20 stories down, so to me that's a long way. So we would go down the shaft. Remember, we did have the technology where a shaft was really just like a corridor to us. So we would switch our devices for buoyancy, and we would just descend, like being in an elevator but without the box around us. At the bottom of this shaft, there is a brief little kind of tunnel, and then a small room. And this room isn't really of much significance. It's just where we would put things that we were moving in or out of the area. So it was just kind of like a little holding place. And this room is actually sealed at one end with some large blocks that we've made to look like a wall. And the reason for this is that if someone were to find the shaft, go down and get into that room, they would think they had found what the shaft was all about. There it was, the room. Nothing in it, but maybe there had been at some stage. People would think, oh, it doesn't seem to go anywhere. But it did go somewhere. One wall was actually not a real wall. It was a large piece of stone made to look like a wall. Anyway, from there, if the artificial stone wall was not there, there was another hallway. And that went into another area, which was a larger room. Once again, that room was sealed at one end and made to look like it was a wall. You probably have noticed from the episodes on technology that we did have some pretty good techniques for making stone walls that really looked like they were natural. Anyway, both of those areas were well sealed off. And if anyone were to break into the area, they'd just think the whole thing was just a piece of normal bedrock. So once in the tunnel at the opposite side, it was a reasonable walk. There was quite a lot of distance to make. And there were other tunnels coming off from there, which could be very confusing for people who didn't know exactly where they were going. So I'm just going to focus on where I was going. So I kept walking along until I got to a very large opening. It was filled with water, but there was a walkway on both sides of this. Let's say it looks like a large swimming pool. And in the center there is a stone box. And round the outside there is a walkway. And you could actually walk both sides of this big cavern area. It was a squarish cavern, and the walkways were reasonable, safe width, and then there was the water, and then there was the stone box in the center. Now this is quite important because what was there when we set it all up was a machine. If the water level got to a certain point, it would convert the water to a gas, steam I guess you'd call it, and it would go up through an escape vent, which wasn't particularly big, the vent, and it would go up, and we had quite a tall pipe that, of course, all our pipes were made of stone, that went up into the air, and there was a mechanism within it that the gas could get out, but even if the vent was covered with water, the water couldn't get in through that vent. And so, when the water levels rose over a certain point, this was where the water was drained from the tunnels, so it didn't get into the areas which were particularly important to us, and it kept things dry that needed to be kept dry. So we walk around this big cavern, we can walk on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, and the reason it had both sides as walkways was because when the machine was operating, when we were setting it up, we needed access from both sides in order to get it in place and then later to remove it. So there's another hallway from this room at the opposite side, and we walk through that and we come to other various rooms, and some of them are down a hallway and they've got niches in them with large stone boxes, and others there's just a niche where it is with the box in it. And we had a variety of different sizes of boxes depending on what it was that we were storing in them. We used hard stone for our boxes, and we did not carve on the boxes. There are no inscriptions from us on the boxes. Anything that you may see on any boxes that are maybe granite boxes or harder, you will not find something from my people. We would, however, occasionally carve an instruction onto a wall where relevant. Our language was no longer written, and so it's kind of hard for me to explain, but any records we left of our history or with scientific information or anything like that was not written in a language that could be translated easily. It's very hard to explain, but if anyone is interested, I will do an episode specifically on language and how it evolved for us in Tantal, as well as after the deluge, when we helped the primitive peoples around the world develop their own form of language and writing. I forgot to mention that there were places where we carved instructions on the walls. And the reason we did that was if it was a piece of equipment, for example, and we thought that maybe the person who might eventually find it might not have that knowledge, we would do a diagram so that they could understand what that piece of equipment was for and how they could benefit from it. So there are some carvings down there, and we left those carvings in situ when we took out all the equipment that we did remove. We didn't bother taking any of the large stone boxes either. We just left them where they were. Within the stone boxes, for the things that were in there, we also had instructions in them as well. But when the time came, we took those away. They weren't carved on any walls, so we just took them with us. Okay, back to the topic of the tunnels and the hidden rooms under the Sphinx. Every now and again we would create a false door, or we would block up a door that we just wanted to keep it so that if somebody did get down there, they wouldn't find their way through that easily through the whole thing. And create a few passages which basically went to nowhere. It was our way of just confusing people who actually got into it, if they did get into it. When we had removed everything, all that was left was a large number of tunnels, a large lake in one area, and I think there were a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 smaller lakes as backup for water extraction as well. And of course we left the boxes, and only a couple of places there would have been the carving on the walls. And what else? I think that's pretty much all we left. So if anyone were to go down under the Sphinx, they might be a bit disappointed. The area where the pumping machine was is very beautiful. it looks like a large lake underground. And yeah, it's unusual and nice and peaceful. And I think that's probably the most exciting thing that people would find if they went under the Sphinx, because we have already taken away all of the stuff that I guess a lot of people would have liked to have got their hands on. So the bits of technology, the information about Tantal, the secrets of medicines and vibrations, and a lot of scientific information was in there. And there was also a lot of stuff to help repopulate a lot of, let's call it seed DNA if we needed it. And yeah, just can't think of what else was in there. As you can see from this pretty awful map that I've tried to draw, the interesting stuff wasn't necessarily directly underneath the Sphinx. Oh, and the angle of the tunnels in no way corresponds to the direction of the dynastic causeway that is in that vicinity. I have had plenty of regressions covering what we did after that, when we'd collected everything from the various restarter locations, where we went and how we helped humanity. But I think I really should focus on the time frame of Tantal, because I've already spanned an enormous length of time even talking about Tantal. And if I was starting on talking about what happened in the Egyptian culture, the Mesopotamian, South America, Europe, China, India, and Japan, one of my favorites, then I would be going off topic, really. I would definitely be going off topic. So either I will wait till I've got through all the Tantal, and shortly after the deluged kind of stuff. I know I've done a few bits on Egypt, but if people do want to know more about the equipment that we had underneath the Giza Plateau and what we were doing with it, and what we had in those big boxes, I'm perfectly happy to put together some more detail on that, because I do know that is interesting, and I think there are lots of topics that I could address separately from just this one episode that I've done. I've actually got a list of all my episodes that I've done to date, and next to each one I've got all the additional topics that I could address based on just the things from a single episode. And so the list is getting longer and longer, but there's a lot to tell, an enormous lot to tell. I don't think that even the quantity of journals that I've shown you the photo of can do it justice, because I just wrote down quick notes after I woke up, and there's just so much for me to tell you, which I will eventually get around to telling you. I certainly hope so, unless something terrible goes wrong, and in which case, oh gosh, yeah. One last thought. Imagine if the archaeologists today found the vents from that large area where the machine used to be. And let's, for argument's sake, say they sent down one of those medical camera things that looks a bit like a snake. I can't remember what they're called. But let's say they sent it right down and in. It went into that area. Then all they would see was a large amount of water, a stone box, just a very, very large cavern. I wonder if they'd even think that it was worth looking at any more than, just looking at it the way they have done, I would imagine they'd think, well, there's no treasure here. There's nothing really exciting. So let's move on. Let's see what else there is around. Unless, of course, the dynastic Egyptians got in there and they put some stuff in there. And that's always a possibility because they were very keen on finding anything to do with the ancients. I will leave you with just the little maps that I've put together. So the areas where I think the entrance is. I know it's a bit of a wide area, but because everything's changed so much, it's really hard to give an exact placement of where the entrance is, and also the map of the tunnels and the main caverns of the area underneath the Sphinx. Anyway, thank you for listening, and hopefully I didn't miss anything exciting or important, and I will catch you all next time.